All right, let's give this a go. I think that's better. I think right there. Right there might be better. All right, so let's test it. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. This is episode number 7, Strength Made Simple. All right, let's go. 3, 2, 1, and hello, and welcome to another edition of the Muscle Mind Podcast. My name is Rory John O'Sullivan, and here we talk about how to build a better body and brain so we can perform at our best, physically and mentally, and so we can just show up in every part of our life at our absolute best, at our peak, at the full extent of what we can really achieve as human beings. So that's really the outcome of what we talk about here and what I try to share with you, not only through my own experience, but through being a coach for the last couple of years and for certifying a bunch of life coaches and personal trainers, and really trying to find out what are the best practices for physical and mental well-being. How do we show up at 110% every day? So today's episode is Strength Made Simple. So the whole goal of today is to give anyone who is an intermediate or beginner in the gym who's trying to make progress, specifically in strength training. So you have a goal, you want to increase your strength or perhaps build your muscle in some way. Now, we're going to go deep into essentially how can we build a consistent system for being in the gym and making progress. So what you'll find is that the science behind this and the actual program, for lack of a better term, the programming behind getting bigger muscles and getting stronger physically in the gym is actually pretty simple. There's not actually that much nuance in it. It's not this very complicated system of things. It's straightforward once you understand the basic principles. So in this discussion today, we are going to be going through a 9-step process, and along the way, we're going to talk about the particulars of how to build the program. But the most important thing, and this is really the whole goal of this episode, is the consistency in applying that program. And that is, to be honest, what I've seen, especially in my career and through all the coaches and the PTs I've spoken to, it's the consistency that's the most challenging part. So if we look at people who start strength training or they just start working out in the gym, once again, the knowledge can be a limiting factor, meaning that it could be that they don't know what to do or they don't know how to do it. And that's why they're not seeing results or really getting into the swing of it and making it a regular part of their routine and their lifestyle. But most of the time, it's actually just the consistency. It's the consistency of getting in the gym and doing the work that needs to be done. So the whole goal of today's session is to give you a system to do that, to combine not only what to do and how to do it, but also how you can make this a consistent part of your daily routine and your life. And I guess the whole moral of the story is that consistency is both the biggest challenge that most people face when they start an exercise program and the underlying factor that makes the people who are successful in that endeavor as successful as they are. It's the consistency to show up every day. And a lot of that comes not only through discipline, but from structuring your training as around your life, not just your body. Creating a training program that works not just for the physical, but for the practical, right? For the fact that you have kids, you have a job, you have hobbies, you have a social life, you have all these other things in your life that demand your time and attention. And even though we know that exercise is very important, it's not always the easiest thing to do to implement it in our life, especially if we haven't been exercising or it hasn't been a consistent part of our life throughout our childhood or just at any stage in our life, really. So that being said, let's go straight into this 9-step process. So before we get into this, just sit up nice and tall in your chair, or if you're driving, keep your hands on the steering wheel, chest up, shoulders back, just retract those shoulder blades so you open up your chest and you bring your shoulder blades backwards, shoulders drop down from the ears, take a nice deep breath in, and release. We always want to be in an optimal state to learn before we jump in. So, 9-step process. If you are an intermediate or a beginner in the gym and you want to be more consistent and see more sustainable results, let's jump into it. So step number one is actually quite simple, but most people skip this step. And step number one is, what do you want? What is the target that you're actually looking to create? Now, a lot of people have an idea of what they want, but they seldomly take the time to write that down on paper and to get really into the details of what that goal is. So what I want you to do now is just think to yourself, what do I really want to achieve in terms of my physique? We're doing resistance training, we're doing strength training, we're trying to get stronger and build more muscle. What does that specifically look like? Now, the first way you can go about this is quite a useful method if you use it correctly, which is to find a role model. Find someone with a physique that you like and that you would like to have on your own body. This is a great way because obviously it's visual, right? It's something our brains can really latch onto that image and print that in front of our mind and tell us, that's what we want, that's the goal we're shooting for. Now, using a comparison photo like this can be helpful, but it's important to note that there's a downside to it as well if it's used incorrectly, and that is over-comparison. Over-comparison and comparison in general is the thief of all joy. I'm sure you've all heard that statement before. Comparison is the thief of joy. And it really is true. If we consistently compare ourselves to other people and we constantly focus on what's missing and what's lacking, and we ruminate on that, that can be a bad place to be because it really puts us in a downward spiral and it drops our energy, our strength, our confidence. But if we use the comparison image and the comparison style of motivation in the right way, it can really draw us in, right? It can give us that constant reminder of what we're shooting for. And again, a role model, right? The values, the look, the physique that we'd want to emulate in ourselves. So that is one method to do it. Another quick note on that is that you have to be realistic in terms of the role model that you select. And you have to be realistic about it for physical reasons and for, how to say this politically, lifestyle choice reasons. So let's look at lifestyle choice reasons first. If I am comparing myself or creating this image, looking at this image of let's say a professional bodybuilder that I want to look like, I have to be very aware of what is the lifestyle that person has that has allowed them to achieve that physique. Now, what I mean here could relate to things like performance enhancing drugs, like steroids, with the question then being, well, if I want to look like that, I have to understand that some steroids probably went into that mixture. Now, there's no judgments on that, each to their own, but we have to consider that, because if I constantly pick a role model that has created what they have using a method that I would never choose to use, it's not going to be sustainable because the chances of me attaining that physique without the use of steroids are much lower. Now, that doesn't mean you can't achieve a lot by hard work and discipline, don't get me wrong, but when you throw anabolic steroids into the mix, it's a whole nother ballgame, right? You're dealing with a completely different animal in essence because your whole internal chemistry is different. So, point is, pick a role model, pick something that you can look at to visualize towards, but understand the lifestyle that went into that. Not just the steroids, but also the time and the energy commitments. Can you commit to eating chicken and rice every day for 6 months on end to get that physique? Can you commit to 2 hours in the gym every single day, 7 days a week? It depends on your lifestyle. So when you pick that role model, pick it in a way that emulates the lifestyle you'd want to live. I'll give you an example of this. If you think of someone that you'd like to emulate, meaning someone that you aspire to be like financially, you have to consider what they did to get those finances, right? And the lifestyle they have that gave them that life. Maybe they work 6 hours a day, 6 hours a day? Let's get this right. 6 hours a day would be fantastic. What if they worked 6 days a week, 14 hours a day to get that level of wealth? Now, you might just see the wealth in the bank account and say, I want that, without considering what had to go into that person's lifestyle in order to achieve that. And it's not about you not being able to do that or not being good enough to do what they did. It's actually a very simple question. Do you want to do that, right? Do you want to work 6 days a week, 14 hours a day? So it's really just about thinking of who is that role model and picking them in a way that is holistic, not just for what they have, but understanding the lifestyle involved in getting to what they had in the end in the first place. So pick that role model accordingly. Now, I know that's a lot of information just for picking someone you want to look like, but those are the things we need to think of. Both the lifestyle factors, right, and the practicality of it, the time, the energy, and the overall sacrifice that you'll have to make to get there. So figuring that out, getting that role model, great way to do it. What you can also do, and what I would encourage, is also to be a little bit more technical about it. So when I say technical, what I mean is take the body and have a look at all the different muscles in your body. Now, you can do this from an aesthetic point of view. So for example, literally standing in the mirror and saying, okay, well, which muscles are quite developed, which muscles are not so developed. So it can be from an aesthetic point of view, right? I look at my glutes, I want my glutes to be bigger. Well, I look at my shoulders, I want my shoulders to be bigger, but my legs, they look quite okay. So I'm actually happy with the way my legs look. So that's a useful way to do it for aesthetic reasons, right? So you can actually see what is the muscle on your body that you want to bring up, or which are the muscles, rather, that you want to increase in size and in strength. You can also look at this from a functional point of view. And what I mean by that is the balance of the body in terms of strength. Now, I would really recommend this, right? Because you can get into a situation where if you just focus on the aesthetic side, like, I want my chest and my shoulders and my traps to be really big, that could be awesome, and you could work on them and get the aesthetic outcome of having big muscles on the front of your body. But functionally, if you don't have the same amount of muscle on the back to balance the muscle on the front, it's probably going to cause you issues in terms of your posture, which might lead to neck issues or back issues. Now, I actually went through this myself when I was a bodybuilder. And when you look in the mirror, what muscles do you see? Chest, shoulders, traps, right? So I developed those, they built up, they got big, they got strong, but I hadn't balanced it with the upper back, right? The trapezius, the rear deltoids. And the effect of that is that the whole body kind of starts slumping forward, yeah? It's a lot of tension in the front, but not a lot of strength and stability in the back. So that started causing me issues in terms of my neck pain. So, for example, sitting at a desk, studying or eating, you have this constant pull forward because of all the muscles on the front, and you never actually get to develop the muscles on the back, which then leads to posture issues, etc., etc. So when you're deciding what you want for this method, look at the body, look at the structure, and ask yourself, what are the muscles that I want to develop here? Which are the ones that are most important to me to bring up? So this is how we can start determining what we actually want when it comes to a strength training program, which is really important. We have to identify that from the start. Now, just to clarify, we are talking here about building a strength program to get a bit stronger and to build bigger muscles. If you are out there and your goal is to get toned, understand one thing about toning. Toning is the product of two things: building a bigger muscle and having less fat around that muscle. That is what toning is. When you ask someone if they want to be toned and you ask them what that means, what they say is that they just want to see the muscles more clearly, right? They want to see the muscles with a better shape so that the whole body looks in a better shape, right? It literally has the outline and the shape that they want. So the thing about a muscle is that you cannot change the shape of a muscle. It's absolutely impossible with training to change the shape of a muscle. But what happens is that when a muscle is small and or it has a lot of fat surrounding it, you can't really see it, right? It's like a statue that hasn't been fully carved out of the block of stone, and you can't actually see it properly because it hasn't been defined enough. But if you take a muscle and you make it bigger and you cut the fat down around it, what happens is you start to see that muscle more clearly. So you've gone from a muscle that was small and surrounded by fat, you've made the muscle bigger, which makes it more prominent. You've removed the fat from around it, and now you can start to see the shape more effectively. Not by changing the shape, but by pronouncing and emphasizing the muscle itself and removing everything that covered it. So when we go through this discussion, muscle growth, getting a bit stronger, and getting toned, these are going to be the steps in order to get there. So step number one, what do you want? How do you define that? Either by looking in the mirror and seeing aesthetically what you want, noticing where you need a better balance of muscles and strength in your body, and or by getting a role model, by getting some kind of image, whether it's a famous athlete that you like or just someone that you know or that you've seen that has a great physique, and using that to let your brain know this is what we want, right? This is the goal that we're moving towards. So now that step one is done, let's go on to step number two. Step number two, how will you measure progress? So measuring progress is a logical extension of defining what you want. So in anything in life, if you have a problem that you want to solve or you have something you want to achieve, there's always 2 points. It's like a GPS system, right? There's where you are now, the current situation, and there's where you want to be, which is your ideal outcome. You are in one state, one place, one objective, and you don't want to be there anymore. It's become a problem for you because it's either painful to be there or you just want to create something new. So you have where you are and you have where you want to be. But in order to make the path from where you are to where you want to be, you have to have some kind of way to measure if you're going in the right direction. It's like walking out into the middle of the desert, trying to get to a location that's 1,000 kilometers away and doing it without a compass. How will you ever know if you're still going in the right direction? You could sprint as fast as you want across that desert, but if you're not going in the right direction, all of that work is going to waste. And that's what we want to avoid by determining how to measure progress. So that when we are training, when we are putting our time and energy and effort into our gym workouts to get the result we want, we are actually aware we're measuring our progress to see if it is working or not. And that's the benefit to defining your metrics, which are easily put the units of measurement for anything that you want to achieve. So if we look specifically at growing muscle, right? Toning, growing muscle, getting the muscle stronger. There are usually a handful of metrics that people use, and you don't need to use all of them, but it's good to use a combination of them. So the first and most obvious one that most people use, that I think is actually the most effective way to do it, is simply progress photos. There's an old saying, if you want to measure your fitness, stand in front of a mirror naked, go over to your couch and move it across the room and move it back. If you like what you see in the mirror, if you were able to move the couch and you're not too much out of breath, you're probably fit enough to be healthy. So you can do that. Interesting method, but a very effective one apparently. I can't say I've ever whipped my clothes off and moved my furniture around, but the point is that seeing that visual representation and testing performance is a critical way for you to determine if you are moving in the right direction. So when we pick our metrics, we need to think of, well, if I was in the position that I want to be, if I had the physique that I want, if I had the strength and the muscle and the toning that I desired, how would I know that I've achieved it? What would a person who has that physique look like and be able to do? That is the question you ask when you determine your metrics. Now, to me, if we are strength training to build muscle, at the end of that, at the end goal, I should obviously, number one, physically see a change in the musculature on my body. I can look at a picture today compared to 6 weeks ago, and I can see that my deltoid is bigger than it was before, that my quadriceps are more toned and defined than they were 6 weeks ago. So a progress photo is a great method to test the aesthetics and to visually see the outcome that you want. Specifically, if your outcome is for aesthetics to look a different way, a progress photo is the golden standard, right? Because we can take a billion other measurements. We can focus on a million other metrics, but if you don't change the way you look, and your goal was to change the way you look, then what was the point of all the work in the first place, right? You have to be able to see the change. So progress photos, beautiful way to track progress, especially when building muscle, to see that change in the body. Next up, and we're gonna go back around and loop around to things like measuring weights and measuring body fat and how to do all of those things and muscle mass, etc., etc. But a beautiful metric to track, and we'll talk about this more when we look at the program itself, is your performance in the gym. So for example, if you were able to take a 20 kg barbell and lie on your back and do 10 repetitions of a bench press. 20 kgs, 10 repetitions. If you could do that today, then in 6 weeks' time, when we finish the program, you should be able to either do that same 20 kgs for more than 10 reps, or do that 10 reps for a higher weight, for example, 30 or 40 kgs. Those are performance metrics, and they are also clearly one of the best ways to determine whether you're seeing the result that you want. Why? Well, if we think back to how we determine the metrics, we look at the end outcome that we want. Once we have that, what would we look like and what would we be able to do, right? What we would look like is going to be dependent on the progress photos. What we can do is going to be determined by what we are physically putting out in the gym. Are our muscles able to lift a higher load for more repetitions at the end of the program? If they are, that means they have got stronger. If they are capable of doing more volume, then logically they will be bigger, because the muscle would have had to adapt in order to get to the place where it could perform that amount of force and output. So performance metrics are another great one. You can do this in terms of 1 rep max, or as I prefer to do when it comes to hypertrophy, is do a 5 rep max or a 10 rep max. It's more practical and you're able to test it easier without risking any injury. So progress photos, performance metrics in terms of your main lifts, and we should mention that, I guess, those performance metrics, right? If we're testing how many reps and how much weight over the weeks to see the progress in strength, you should aim for those to be on only a few lifts. So for example, your squat, your deadlift, and your bench press. The reason we pick these 3 is because if you test and do a performance test, 5 rep, 10 rep, 15 rep max, with those core lifts, those 3 core lifts, you will be testing effectively every muscle in the body in the most efficient way. So you don't have to test and test and test for a whole session because you've got 100 exercises. You just pick those main ones to test the overall strength and therefore increase in size of the body over those 6 weeks. And when I say 6 weeks, it could be 8 weeks, 12 weeks. 6 weeks is just your basic standard program that most people follow. So we have discussed now progress photos, and we've discussed performance metrics. Now, there are some other things you can measure. So now the obvious one, a lot of the time, for people who want to get toned specifically, or who want to get lean, is they'll use body weight, right? You jump on the scale and you see the difference. Now, this gets a bit tricky because if you're trying to build muscle, right, which is the purpose of the session, you may or may not also want to lose fat in the process. Now, building muscle and losing fat are 2 completely different physiological processes. Building muscle is about triggering stimulus of protein synthesis in the muscle by eating protein and lifting weights in a particular way, and a bunch of other scientific mumbo jumbo that goes on in between. But essentially that is it when you're trying to build muscle. You're trying to use training to trigger the growth, and you're trying to use protein, food, and sleep and recovery to get the growth of that muscle. When we're talking about fat loss, that's a completely different scenario. It's a completely separate function in the body. Fat loss is all about creating a calorie deficit, meaning that the body's use of energy for that day is higher than the amount of energy that has been consumed. And when that happens, there's a gap because the body needs to find that excess energy. It's not just going to turn off the brain or stop you dead in your tracks while you're running. It's going to find that energy somewhere. And it finds that energy by tapping into fat, because all fat is a cell that stores excess energy. So when energy is low in the body goes to the fat, takes some energy out, and voila, it has a free source of energy right there so that you can keep doing whatever you're doing. So they are 2 different things. So when you use weight as a metric, it's important that you understand its limitations. It can be good because it can show you fluctuations in body weight, of course, but there's so many other things that influence it. Are you building muscle? Are you losing fat? And is that why the weight on the scale is not moving? Are you perhaps losing water? Is it perhaps that you just ate more food that day by the time you weighed yourself? So weight is probably the most common way people measure their success in terms of fitness, but it's, to be honest, not the most effective, in my opinion. So weight is there. You can use it if you'd like, but I'd highly suggest you also track your performance metrics in the gym and the actual aesthetics of the muscle. So now that we've done weight, another interesting one to measure is girth. Now, girth is great because girth is all about what is the actual physical circumference of a particular muscle. So when I say girth, what I mean is taking a tape measure in centimeters or millimeters or whatever the case is, or inches, and physically measuring the different parts of the body. So measuring the circumference of the bicep, measuring the circumference of the thigh. And this is, of course, going to give you very real feedback as to how physically big the muscle is. So girth is another amazing metric to track. And just by the way, what we're going to be doing after we run through these metrics is just deciding which of these metrics to use, right? Because you don't need to use all of them. And as a final discussion, we have body composition analysis machines. So when you are using a body composition analysis machine to track your progress and to measure how you've increased in muscle mass or decreased in fat, this is a beautiful way to measure your progress because obviously you're getting very accurate information about what's physically going on at a composition level in the body, right? So the way a lot of these body composition machines actually work is they work through bioelectrical impedance. So try to say that one quickly. Bioelectrical impedance. And what this does is when you step onto that machine, right? Your feet go onto those silver panels, right? Your hands and your thumbs go onto the little thingies you hold out on the side. You stand there, it plays that really weird music, and then it gives you your results in terms of body fat and muscle mass. Now, the way it got that information is that it sends an electrical impulse through your body from the bottom all the way to the top and back down again. And depending on how long that signal takes to go up and back down again, that will determine how much of your body is muscle, fat, and water. Now, why would that make a difference? Because that electrical impulse moves at different speeds through those three different materials, those three different types of matter. So that electrical impulse will move at a different speed through muscle compared to fat, compared to water. And that is how they actually work. Now, there's a lot of debate over how accurate these machines are, but they are a very useful way to measure your progress in this area of muscle growth and getting lean, losing body fat, because they literally give you the numbers behind it, which is a lot more practical for some of us, right? It's nicer, it's easier. I just stand on the machine and it spits out a number and I can compare what is the number today to what was the number 6 weeks ago. So from a practical point of view, they work really well. But the problem is that they can still be very inaccurate. So for example, if the body composition analysis tells you that you are 20% body fat and you have 40 kgs of muscle and 30 kgs of fat, do not test me on those numbers. My math is shocking. But if that's the data that it gives you, that doesn't necessarily mean that that data is accurate. You may not be 20% body fat. You may be 15% body fat. But the benefit is that if you measure on that same machine every single time in the same conditions, it may not be an accurate number that it gives you, but it will be consistent. So if I jump onto the machine and it tells me 20% body fat, I don't care if I'm actually 20% body fat. All I care about is that next week, when I jump onto that machine again, that same machine, I can see that it's less than 20%. It shows me that I'm moving in the right direction. And this obviously then applies to all three things that you majorly get from these machines, which is body fat percentage, which is great because you can see the difference in the effect of more muscle and less fat, muscle mass in kgs, and fat in kgs. So these machines can be useful. It just is a matter of framing yourself properly and not looking at the number and seeing that as the absolute truth, but rather seeing it as something that you can just measure one time after another to see a difference, right? It's the change that's more important than the actual number that it's giving you. So the whole point here, as we went on a very long, in-depth example of each of these metrics, pick the ones that are most effective and that are going to be the easiest for you to do. So progress photos, performance metrics, amazing. Performance metrics is a must, so you have to get that one in. On top of that, I just want you to pick 2 other metrics from that list that are the easiest for you, the most motivating for you to track. For example, if you find measuring yourself with the girth a little bit weird, or it's just uncomfortable, or you don't like it, don't choose it. If you don't want to take progress photos because for whatever reason you're embarrassed, it's a mission, you cringe when you look at yourself, whatever the case is, it doesn't matter. You don't need to pick it. Just make sure you pick at least 3 metrics from this list, including your performance metrics. Okay, so we've gone through step 1 and step 2. Now let's have a look at step number 3. How much time and energy can you commit to being in the gym? This is probably the most important step. How much time and energy can you realistically and practically commit to getting in the gym and lifting weights? This question has to be answered before you can do anything else. Now, the thing is, we all have time. Yes, we all have time. We all have the same 24 hours in a day. The different results we get in life is determined by how we spend those 24 hours. Now, we have a lot of things on, so I'm not having to go at anyone that's not spending 3 hours in the gym every day. We all have different priorities. We all have lives that contain so many different elements. But if our ancestors could spend the majority of their time doing physical activity, running away from prey, or running away from predators rather, running after prey, foraging, moving, walking, traveling, if they could spend that much time moving around just in their day-to-day lives to build things, to kill animals, to forage, to build, to move, can't we dedicate at least 30 minutes twice a week to getting a little bit stronger? Now, that's what I would suggest to be the minimum dose, the minimum effective dose of strength training to see a difference. Now, I'm not saying if someone does 1 time per week that it's not good or it's not beneficial. Of course it is. But I'd like to think we can set the standard just a little bit higher and go for 2 rounds of 30 minutes per week. An average episode of a Netflix series, 45 to 60 minutes. That's literally what you'll be dedicating throughout the entire week to something that's going to give you the most incredible benefits in terms of the way you look, the way you feel, the way you think, your confidence, your energy, your strength. I think it's a pretty fair trade-off. So 2 times per week, 30 minutes per day, right? So 1 hour total. That is going to be the bare minimum. Now, what you need to do is decide for yourself how much time are you going to commit. If that's the bare minimum, perfectly fine. But if you can do a little bit more, even better. So we need to consider what can we do realistically during a week. Now, if you are just starting, and by just starting, I don't mean you've trained before in your life and I mean you're just starting and you haven't been in a momentum for a while, whether that's because you've never trained or because you just haven't trained in a while. I would still advise you to take a look at your schedule and ask yourself, what could I do in my worst week? So what could I commit to doing even if everything in a week went wrong? I had appointments that came up that I was not expecting at all. The car broke down and I had to take it in to get fixed. I ended up staying late at work 3 days in the week. The worst week possible. What could you commit to putting time and effort into the gym? How much time and effort could you commit? So the reason we want to work backwards from there is that if you look at the patterns of why people end up not being consistent, is because they set a bar so high that it doesn't end up being realistic for their general life. And not just for their life on the normal day, but for when chaos happens. You often hear the story in the gym when someone returns and they said, yeah, I was in a great routine for a long time, but then my car broke down, I had a big project at work, it was my kid's birthday, and it all happened at once, and then I didn't exercise at all, and I just fell out of the routine. That is a tale as old as time. And the reason we put the bare minimum in on the worst week is so that we avoid breaking routine. Now, is 5 days per week better than 2? Yes. But is 0 per week better than little something? Of course not. The consistency matters more than anything. So even if you get to the point where you're only doing the 2 days, 30 minutes per week, because that's what you can do right now because life is chaotic, that's awesome. Because when something unexpected happens, it's not going to throw you so off track that you stop doing it completely. Because when you stop completely, it's not the effects on the body that are the issue. It's not missing the training and missing the ability to grow your muscles. It's the fact that your brain breaks the habit of exercising consistently, which makes it much harder to return and get back into that habit. So we are very much focused when we pick your schedule on focusing on what is going to be the best way to stay consistent so I do not interrupt the routine and the pattern and the behavior that is getting me into the gym on a regular basis. So that's where we are at when it comes to the schedule. So what I want you to consider now is what days, at what times can you commit to training every week, even in your worst week? You can think of this in terms of Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 5 p.m. I train. You could consider it in terms of, well, I'll make sure I get 30 minutes in twice per week. It just depends week by week when that day will be, right? Because some weeks may be different to others. Either method is fine. But the end now of step 3 is to really set up your phone, right? Pick up your phone, as long as you're not driving, open your calendar, and literally go and schedule in your appointment with the gym. When you schedule it in, it's going to happen. If you think about it, it's an idea. If you write it down, it becomes a goal. When you schedule it in, it becomes an inevitable outcome. We always are stuck and bound by our schedules, whether it's an actual physical schedule on our laptop or our phone, or whether it's just by our day-to-day appointments that we know we need to keep. We are bound by our schedules because our schedules give us structure. But it's quite interesting because not many people put exercise onto their schedule. It's such a simple step. I remember training a guy a couple of years ago, and he was a very successful, very wealthy businessman, very, very busy, right? Always going from meeting to meeting, often used to change our session time, but still quite a consistent guy. Until the year end would come. Then he would start falling off track. And it wouldn't even just be the last month, it would be the 3-4 months leading up to that. So eventually one day we had a conversation and I asked him, do you schedule our sessions? Because very often he would change the times. Again, pretty consistent, but he would change the time a lot. And he said, well, my schedule is so busy that there's no way that I can really schedule our sessions in because things, come up and then I need to do certain things. And I said, okay, well, that's fair. Tell me, what would happen if you didn't schedule in the majority of your meetings and you moved them around, you didn't go sometimes because it didn't fit your schedule? What would that do to your business? And he said, well, that would be unprofessional. He said that there's no way I could operate like that and expect my staff to do the same. And it wouldn't really help me because I would probably break a lot of important relationships and not hit a lot of important deadlines. So then I asked him, well, then what is the difference with training? Don't you think that a slot in your calendar, a slot in your schedule should be dedicated to something as important as building your body so you can be strong and healthy into your old age? And once he started scheduling in our sessions, it was so interesting to see that he stopped being inconsistent, right? He stopped changing the times. He stopped missing a lot of sessions because it was literally a part of his schedule and a part of his life. It was an appointment that he couldn't miss because he was so consistent and so structured and so loyal to the obligations that he'd committed to. And now that training was thrown into that pot, he became a lot more successful in it. So scheduling your training in, what can you do on your worst week? The bare minimum, 2 days per week, 30 minutes per day. How are you going to structure it? When are you going to do it? So now that you've got your days in, You've set aside the time and the days. Let's have a look at step 4, which is all about picking your exercises. So picking your exercises is about picking the exercises that are going to give you the most bang for your buck. Now, this was a podcast about how to help people become more effective bodybuilders. There'd be a long list of exercises we could look at here, and we could go into a lot more detail on it. But if you're just looking to get stronger, build more muscle, get toned, and lifting weights is not the be-all and end-all of your day, and it is most certainly not the only obligation or the obligation that you're putting the most time and energy into, we need to make things simple, we need to make things efficient. And the way that we do that is by focusing on the main movements and exercises that give you the most stimulus of the most amount of muscles, so you get the most amount of results for the least amount of time. As I'm sure you would agree, time is the biggest challenge here, which is why in step 3, we went over how we could make the time work for us. But once we have that time, it's precious. We need to make sure we are doing only the most effective things. So as an example, you can have an exercise like the squat. Now the squat is going to be the king of exercises when it comes to the quadriceps and the glutes. Now, does that mean that something like a leg extension is a waste of time? Of course not. If you want to develop a certain part of your quadricep and isolate that part and only work your quadricep, the leg extension is a beautiful choice. But it is an additional exercise which takes additional time. If you are looking for the most effective bang for your buck, the return on investment on big movements like a squat or a deadlift are going to be much higher compared to the time and energy investment that you've put into them. So this is the mentality we need to have if we're trying to preserve time and energy and get the results in the gym that we want. We have to pick the best return on investment exercises, as measured by the time that we put into it versus the stimulus and the result that that exercise produces for the body. So what we're going to do now is we're going to have a look at the 6 main movement patterns that we need to incorporate that will give us that biggest return on investment. Now you'll notice I said movement patterns. I didn't say exercises. We have an episode out called the top 10 best strength exercises. And in that episode, we talked a little bit about movement patterns versus exercise. But to give you the basics of it, the human body has certain core movements, right? A movement pattern is just a particular type of movement. An exercise is a way of moving that matches a particular movement pattern, sometimes combining multiple movement patterns into one exercise. For example, the squat is not an exercise. It is a movement pattern. It is the act of the glutes dropping down, the knees flexing, and the whole body coming down below the knees and exploding back up. The knees start to extend and straighten out. The glutes move forward, and voila, we are in a standing position. The squat is just a basic human movement. But something like a barbell squat is an exercise in the squat movement pattern. Even something like a leg press, which looks very different from a squat, is a squat movement pattern because it goes through the same motion. It's just a different exercise. So I'm going to take you through the main movement patterns, and I'm going to give you 1 or 2 examples very briefly of exercises that fall into that. Have a look at that episode on the top 10 best strength exercises, and it'll help you fill in the exercises for each movement pattern a little bit more effectively. But for now, let's just give you a breakdown of the 6 movement patterns and some examples. So, number 1, the squat. Now this could be something like a goblet squat, a bodyweight squat, a box jump even, a leg press. But exercise number 1 is your squat. Exercise number 2 is your hinge movement. A hinge movement could be a deadlift, a standard deadlift or a stiff leg deadlift. It could also be something like a glute bridge or a kettlebell swing. Then we have our push movement pattern. Now push can actually be horizontal or vertical, but let's just go through some basics, right? We're just going for the best bang for our buck for now. In the push movement pattern, we could do a push-up, a bench press, or a machine press, right? Anything where we're just pushing something away from our body. Then we have pull. Once again, pull can be broken down into a horizontal pull and a vertical pull, but in this example, we're just going to use something that covers either of those bases. So in your pull movement pattern, you could have a pull up, a pull down, or some kind of row, whether it's a machine row or bent over dumbbell row, something where you're pulling something towards your body, either horizontally or vertically. So the goal here then is to be taking these 4 movements. We're going to put them into your days in a moment, but thinking of which exercises could I use that fall into these movement patterns. Picking the exercises that you are most comfortable with so that you can do them effectively. The final 2 are actually movements of the core. So the one is going to be core flexion. This is when the upper body comes down and then back up again. The spine flexes and then it extends. This could be something like a sit-up, a leg raise, a dead bug, something where you're kind of opening and closing like a book, right? Your core is contracting and then coming back out. Hands and the feet are going out and away and then down and towards each other. That is the flexion movement pattern. And last but not least, we have rotation. So rotation, I've put this in here because rotation is a movement pattern that we actually very seldomly do. Even if we're usually training in the gym, most things are linear, right? They happen in this movement pattern, right? It's always front to front, front to back. We seldom do things where we are rotating, where we are twisting our body. So for core rotation, you could do exercises like the Russian twist, a Pallof twist, a bicycle crunch, or a rotational wall ball, where you basically stand with one of those big balls and you twist and you throw it to the side, usually at a wall, pick it up and repeat on the other side. So anything where you are rotating. So we have these basic movements: squat, hinge, push, pull, core flexion, and rotation. For now, just think of those movements, and I want you to pick one exercise from each of those movement patterns. Just one, whichever one you feel the most comfortable with. Now, as a side note, if you selected that there were muscle groups, right, when we did step number 1 and we planned what you wanted, if there were muscle groups that you specifically want to work on, that you want to give extra emphasis to, what I would suggest is now pick one isolation exercise for that muscle that you can include in your program as well. Now, this is just an add-on. This is if you want to emphasize a muscle in particular over everything else. And if you have a little bit more time, right? If you've given yourself 4 days or 3 days a week of 60 to 90 minutes, you've definitely got time to add isolation exercises. But it's not an absolute necessity. But if you do have the time and the energy and you want to focus on a particular muscle group, as we determined in step number 1, put an isolation exercise in this list of exercises that we have. So by now, we should have the time of the day, right, that we're going to train, right, including the length of time, and we should have 6 exercises at least written down. Because now what we're going to do is we're going to organize these exercises into different days. So there's 2 options here when it comes to now saying, I've got the day and the time, I've got the exercises, when do I do which exercise? How does it work, right? So option number 1, if you are doing 2 to 3 times per week in the gym, if that's what you've selected, and you've given yourself at least 30 to 40 minutes, what you want to do is try and do all the movements on the same day. Now, I know a lot of you might have heard or just seen in general in fitness and on social media, people have a chest day, they have a leg day, a back day. Now that's great, but that is actually better for someone who is a little bit more advanced and someone who has bodybuilding aspirations. If you are a beginner or an intermediate, you don't really need to be splitting your workouts up into specific muscles on specific days. What can be a much better approach is doing your basic movement patterns multiple times throughout the week. Full body routines multiple times. And there's a few reasons why this really works. Number one, you get to practice those movements on a regular basis, so you get better at them. Number two, you get a lot of volume, right? You are frequently hitting the muscles multiple times throughout the week, which is very beneficial for building muscle, getting toned, and overall just increasing the size and tone of your muscle. And on top of that, it's really cool because let's say I plan to do 3 sessions per week. I only get 2 sessions in, but I miss the 3rd session. I've still hit every single muscle twice per week. If I was doing a different muscle on a different day, right? So Monday, Wednesday, Friday, for example, I have chest and back, shoulders and arms, and then legs. If I hit the first 2 sessions but missed the 3rd, now I've neglected a whole area of the body. And now I have to wait a whole extra week to hit that muscle group again. When you do full body sessions, you don't have that problem. You at least know that you've hit every muscle in the body, right? Nothing is being neglected. It may not be as much work as you wanted to do on the muscle, but you haven't missed any muscles. You're not having an imbalance anymore because of your schedule. So, option number 1, do all movements on the same day, 2 to 3 times per week. Now, if you can't do that, if, for example, you are training more than that, right? You're training 4, 5, 6 times per week, then training the muscles every single day, every movement, is going to become too excessive, right? 2 to 3 times per week per muscle is probably your max. So if you are training more than that, then you are going to have to split up the workouts, and instead of doing full body, you're going to have to separate them. Another reason you could also do this is if you find that you're just not recovering, right? If your fitness level is low, or you just struggle to recover because your sleep or your nutrition isn't quite there yet, then doing full body sessions might be a bit tough because you might struggle to recover, right? I do full body on Monday, Tuesday I rest, but Wednesday I'm still absolutely exhausted in all of my muscles. So for either of those 2 reasons, you can change it and you can do a split style. Now, I like to think of this as a day A and a day B. Now, day A and day B are basically just separating those movement patterns into 2 different days. So you have the 6 movement patterns, right? You do 3 and 3. You do 3 on day A and you do 3 on day B. For example, on day A, you could do let's say your squat, your push, and your core flexion. And then on day B, you do your hinge, your pull, and your core rotation. And then you can alternate them. So you have 2 options here, right? You can do every day full body, right? So 2 to 3 times per week, full body. Try separate them if you can by 1 day. Or you can do the A and B split, where you have day A, 3 movement patterns, day B, 3 movement patterns. So that's going to be how you organize your exercises into their days. Now, by this stage, you should know when you're training, how long you're training, and what movements you're doing on those days. The next step, and I know this is a lot to go, so if you need to take a pause on this podcast and wait, write everything out and come back, take the time to do so. In step 6, what we're going to look at is how many sets and reps are we going to be doing with these movements. Now, when it comes to sets and reps, what we're going to do is keep it very simple. We're going to do 3 sets per exercise. 3 sets, that's it. So 3 sets per exercise, and then we look at the rep range. Now the rep range is an interesting one. When you look at toning and building muscle, if we specifically look at how do we actually get a muscle bigger, what is the rep range that is best for building muscle? And the answer is that it can vary, but most of the time, anywhere between 5 to 30 repetitions. So if you're wondering what is the ideal rep range for building muscle, anywhere between 5 and 30 reps is going to do the trick, as long as those sets and those reps are taking the muscle close to failure. That is what the most important factor is in triggering that muscle growth. They've done research on this where they take a bunch of people, they separate them into 3 groups. You have one group doing strength training in the 5 to 10 rep range, another group in the 10 to 15 rep range, and another group in the 15 to 30 rep range. Everything is controlled in terms of their training ability, their nutrition, the amount of weight they're using, etc., relative to the repetitions. And they test to see who grew the most muscle. And the answer was there was very little difference. There was no statistically relevant difference, meaning there was a difference, but it was minuscule, it wasn't really relevant. There was no difference between the groups. The group that trained 5 to 10, 10 to 15, 15 to 30, all grew pretty much the same amount of muscle, as long as when they did those sets and reps, they took the muscle close to failure. So the cool thing about this is that you get to choose. You get to choose which repetition range is best for you. If you prefer going a little bit heavier, 5 to 10 is going to do the trick. If you're going a little bit lighter, 10 to 15, and if you really want to pump up your endurance as well as growing muscle, 15 to 30 will be a great rep range to be in. So 3 sets per exercise. And on the repetition side, I want you to choose the rep range you're going to use, whatever you feel is best. And yes, if you want to have one particular rep range for the squat, for example, and a different one for your push, that's perfectly fine. I, as an example, will do 5 to 10 reps for a squat, but maybe 15 to 20 repetitions when it comes to shoulders and side laterals, because I just find that those rep ranges are better for those muscles. Once again, when it comes to muscle growth, it doesn't make a difference as long as you're taking it close to failure. So 3 sets on each exercise, and I want you to pick the repetition range that you're going to use for each of the different movement patterns. Before we move on to step 7, I think it's just important to note the rest period between sets. So how long should you rest between sets of resistance training to get the best possible muscle growth effect? And the answer is anywhere from 1 to 3 minutes. And the reason is because less than 1 minute, you probably haven't recovered enough, so you're not able to maintain the intensity that you would have. Less intensity, less tension on the muscle, less growth that occurs. So 1 minute is going to be your bare minimum. Now you can go all the way up to 3 minutes of rest. Now, beyond 3 minutes, you're kind of letting the muscle relax a bit too much, right? So with that recovery, with that additional rest time, you're not going to get the best stimulus out of the muscle. But if you keep it under 3 minutes, there's just enough time to recover, catch your breath, let some of that burn go away, but not let the muscle recover so much so that you can keep the intensity high, hit the next set, and continue to trigger that muscle growth. So anywhere from 1 to 3 minutes is perfectly fine. And you'll find this is going to differ per exercise. For example, when you do a squat, it's very intensive on the cardio system. Quads are a big muscle. You're pushing yourself. You're going down, compressing your ribs. It's very taxing on the cardio system too. So, almost as intensive as this podcast apparently, with these deep breaths that I'm taking. But what you then need to do is think to yourself, what's going to be the best rest period for each different exercise? Squats, I'm going to take that whole 3 minutes of rest. Side laterals, 60 seconds is more than enough, right? It's not intensive, it just burns the muscle. So, step number 7, form. You know when you're training, you know what movements you're doing, you know the sets, you know the reps. Form and technique are absolutely essential. Your technique is the biggest factor that will determine if you're going to get muscle growth stimulus out of the exercise that you're performing. The reason for this is not just to stay safe, but it's because when you use an exercise and you go through the entire range of motion on that exercise, you get more muscle growth. And why is that the case? When a muscle is working, when you are contracting against a weight, there are 2 types of contractions that are happening. A concentric contraction, when the muscle contracts against the weight and gets shorter. Like if you curl your biceps up to a flex, right? Or you push your arms together and squeeze your chest. The muscles are getting shorter. That is a concentric contraction. But the muscle doesn't just stop contracting, right, when the weight is being lowered. It keeps contracting, but it contracts eccentrically. And what that means is that as the weight is lowering, my muscle is stretching. And as it stretches, it contracts. And the eccentric contraction produces more damage and more muscle growth than the concentric, which is why it's so important to go all the way down in all of your exercises to the maximum point of stretch, because that's where the majority of the muscle growth is actually being triggered. And this is why people who do half reps, we've all seen people in the gym, 45-degree push-ups, squats that don't even go below parallel, right? Bicep curls that never actually let the wrist drop down any further than 45 degrees. And when you do that, you're cheating yourself because you're missing out on all the muscle growth benefits you could be getting at the bottom end of that stretch where the eccentric contraction is the highest and you're getting the best muscle growth that you get across the whole range of motion of that particular muscle. So, good technique. Go into full range of motion. So really getting to the full range of motion, up and down. This is going to be your best way to grow muscle. Remember, we're talking best bang for buck, yes? So wouldn't you want to make sure you're getting the most growth for the least amount of effort? So that is a note when it comes to form. Full range of motion, controlled the entire way through the exercise. So the final two steps. Step 8, we're going to now look at how do we make progress. This is a key part, right? This is a very important part of this. If we take a recap, we now have the days. We have what we're going to train on what days. We're going to do 3 sets. We know the rep range we're going to be working in, and we know the form that we want to achieve. What we're going to do now is that we're going to think about this program as something that increases over time. So when you start a program, and I'm going to use the example of a 6-week program. When I start a 6-week program, I don't want to be going at my max in week number 1 because it means I'm going to burn out. I'm going to have so much time that I need to recover before the next session that I'm not going to be able to sustainably make progress in the rest of the 5 weeks that come after that. And this is the mistake most people make when they start a fitness routine. On week 1, they go absolutely mental, all energy, everything to failure, and then they miss out on all the rest of the growth they could have got in the 5 weeks that come after that because their body is not recovering properly from that first week. So it's kind of like if I told you, well, you can have 100 reels today, or you can get 10 reels per day for the next 20 days. Which are you going to pick? And that's exactly the same thing people do with their training. They go in the gym on week number 1 and they just want to get that 100 reels, right? The biggest growth, the most results from that 1 week. And you do get it, but you miss out on the 10 reels per day for 20 days, where you'll get a little bit less results in the short term during that session, but you'll get much better results over the long term. So it's really about saying week number 1 is relatively easy. And the way we do that is by saying, let's look at our rep range. I'm just going to use the same example throughout to make it easy. 10 to 15 repetitions I'm going to be working in for this exercise. In week number 1, I should be finding the amount of weight that I can lift for 10 repetitions that allows me to get close to failure, to the point where I can only do 3 more reps. That will be 3 reps in reserve for a 10 rep maximum. On week 1 of a program, that's where I want to be. Every week following that, I'm going to try use that same weight with more repetitions, 1-2 repetitions each session as I gradually increase it. And what's going to happen over time is using that same weight, I'm going to use more and more and more and more repetitions, putting more tension on the muscle, reaching a peak, and getting the maximum amount of muscle growth. Instead of going to failure on 10 reps on week number 1, getting the 100 rails, but missing out on the consistent 10 rails per day all the way for the next 20 days. So what you're going to do is on that first week, you're going to take each of your main movements, pick the bottom end of your rep range. So if you've done 10 to 15, the bottom end is 10. And in week number 1, you're going to find what weight can you do on that movement for 10 reps that you still have only 3 reps left to give by the end of the set. So I do that last rep of 10, I put it down, and I think to myself, I had 3 more reps left, but that would have been complete failure. That is your starting point. That is the weight you are going to use for the rest of the 6-week program. So that you have to make sure you learn that weight and you write it down. So as you take those 6 movements, you find what is the weight I can do for 10 repetitions with 3 reps only left in the tank. Now this is your starting point. This is your starting weight. Now, what you are going to do to progress over the next 6 weeks is you're going to take that same weight every single day that you do that movement. You're going to use that same weight. You're going to do your repetitions, and you're going to try and get 1 to 2 more repetitions with that same weight on those 3 sets every single session. Now, you won't always achieve that, but that is always the goal. So that every session, you're trying to do a few more repetitions per set. The ideal would be 3 to 5 repetitions more each session over the 3 sets. And this is the importance of tracking your numbers when you are doing resistance training. Tracking your numbers when you lift weights is the only way to consistently see if you're getting better and that you are performing better, and therefore that the muscle is increasing in size and strength. So keep a little notebook or a mobile application, and every time that you do that movement, record your weight, your repetitions, and how it felt. Next session, when you go back to that movement, look back at your previous record, and all your goal is for that day is to try get 1 to 2 more repetitions over those 3 sets. And if you consistently do that, you'll consistently see results without burning out in week number 1 or week number 2. So you're going to need to do that for every single one of those 6 movements. Find your baseline number for 10 repetitions with 3 reps left in the tank, and then gradually try and beat those numbers every single session for the rest of the 6 weeks. As a note on that as well, once you get to the peak of that, so let's say you took your 10 repetitions, right, with that weight, the goal is to get from 3 rounds of 10 on that movement to 3 rounds of 15. The whole game is to get from the bottom of your rep range with the same weight and get all of your sets to the top of the rep range. I did 60 kilos of squats for 3 sets of 10 on week 1. The goal consistently over those 6 weeks is to get to the end of the 6 weeks and be able to do 3 sets of 15 reps with that same 60 kg weight. Now you know that the muscle has grown and developed. So that is the goal. If you get to that point, you've done your 3 sets, 60 kgs for 15 repetitions. What you can then look at doing at that stage is moving to increasing the sets, to now adding an additional set and seeing if you can actually hit that additional set for 15 reps. Once that's done, you can also focus to increase your progressive overload on, now that you've nailed that weight, now that you've mastered that weight for 3 rounds of 15, for example. Now, increase the weight. Find yourself a new 10 rep baseline with a higher weight and start the process all over again. So in summary, here's how you would make the best progress in your resistance training. Find your 10 rep max. Find that weight that you can hit your 10 rep max with relative ease, and try get those repetitions with that same weight all the way up to 3 or 4 sets at the top of your rep range. For example, 15 reps with that same weight that you used to be maxing on for 10. Once you've hit all your sets on 15 with that weight, it's like you've beat a boss in a video game. That weight is defeated. Go back, get a heavier weight, find your baseline for 10 reps, and play the game again. Try get all sets to 15 reps to beat the next boss. And the cool thing is that the game never ends because the weights always get heavier. But that is how we can focus on making progress over this time. So these 8 steps are how you would structure your program and how you would consistently increase your performance and therefore increase the results. As a final note, let's have a look at step 9, which is mindset. Mindset is going to be very much the overarching background noise that will determine whether you are able to stick with this in the long run. Now, without going too deep into it, your mindset is your belief systems, or are your belief systems rather. Your mindset around the way that you train is going to have a massive impact on how consistent you are with it and if you really get the best results. There are 3 belief systems that I believe need to be in place for someone to be consistent and effective when it comes to resistance training. Number 1, consistency is more important than intensity. Number 2, friction is your friend. If it's not uncomfortable, you are not going to grow. You will not get better. And number 3, recovery is king. When you're in the gym training, you trigger growth, right? But when you go and sleep and eat and consume protein, that is when you get the change. That is when the body actually adapts and builds the bigger muscles, builds more strength, builds more endurance. It's not during the training, it's during the recovery. So those 3 things are the most important mindsets and belief systems to have in place if you're going to be successful here. Consistency over intensity. Do it consistently over time instead of trying to give everything you have in one session or 1 week. Number 2, friction is your friend. Make sure that your whole goal, as uncomfortable as it is to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. The better relationship that you can have with being uncomfortable, the better results you will have in the gym. Because the person that focuses on the outcome is not as happy as the person who enjoys the walk to get there. And it's the same thing with training. If you are not addicted to the feeling of making yourself uncomfortable and testing yourself, it's going to be very hard to stay consistent because you're not going to get the results straight away. But if the reward, if the good feeling can come from the feeling and act of putting yourself in discomfort, and you get addicted to the feeling of being uncomfortable and getting better, then you have a recipe for success. Because now your brain is associating pleasure with the feeling of friction, with the feeling of challenge, and you become addicted to that. And once you become addicted to that, you don't even need to focus on the outcome. The outcome will be there naturally because friction builds strength and strength builds muscle. And like we said, as a final note, recovery is king. Training stimulates the growth, but recovery is where you actually get the growth. If you neglect your recovery, you will not get the results that you're looking for. You can only grow from what you can recover from. If your recovery does not match the intensity of your training, the gap between the two is going to be lost gains. So if your intensity is here and your recovery is here, you only get the growth in the bottom half. The gap between them, you completely lose because the body can't adapt from what it cannot recover from. So, these were the 9 steps to get yourself to a position where you can consistently train and make sustainable progress over time without burning out. I have gone into a lot of detail on a lot of this, probably too much detail in some cases, but I really hope you come away with the core elements of what we've discussed here today, because truly there is almost nothing on this planet that is more powerful and effective for making you feel strong and confident and energized and helping you live longer and bring more health span to your life than strength training, right? It just is the biggest bang for your buck activity that you can do for your physical and mental well-being. Not only do you condition your body to be strong, but like we discussed in the friction is your friend, you fall in love with the process of being uncomfortable. You fall in love with the process of challenging yourself and failing. That's the beautiful thing about strength training, is that the only way that it works is that if you take it to failure. And when you get comfortable with failing in the strength room when you're lifting weights, that same belief system carries over to the other parts of your life. You start to become addicted to the feeling of failing because you know that the failure will lead to growth. And that is true in the gym, and it is true in every other area of life. So it's not just about the physical benefits that the strength training gives you, it's about the lessons that you learn that can be applied in every single other area to help us live a better life overall. So thank you so much for joining me here today. I hope you've pulled value from what we've discussed here today. And just remember that if you stay consistent, if you consistently focus on your personal growth, and if you fall in love with failure, you will never go hungry for progress. Thank you so much for joining me here today. Have a blessed rest of your day, and I'll see you next time.